This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On October 25th, the Museum of the RCMI hosted a virtual book launch of a new work by best-selling British author Patrick Bishop, Operation Jubilee, Dieppe 1942, The Folly and the Sacrifice, in which the author powerfully and vividly describes the elements of one of the most tragic and controversial episodes of the war. Mr. Bishop was introduced by Museum Director and Curator Ryan Goldsworthy.
Okay, well, let's get started today. So first off, I just want to say good afternoon to everyone and welcome to our RCMI Museum Book Launch webinar. Whether you're an RCMI member, a guest, or a virtual newcomer, we're happy to have you for today's program. My name, of course, is Ryan Goldsworthy. I'm the Museum Director and the Curator of the RCMI Museum. As well, I'm the organizer and the host of today's book launch webinar. So in today's webinar, I'll be hosting British author and journalist Patrick Bishop for the launch of his new book, Operation Jubilee, Dieppe 1942, The Folly and the Sacrifice. I'm happy to report that I'm hosting today's book launch from the RCMI. And behind me, I have two authentic Second World War uniforms who are joining me for the session. Here I have an RCAF officer's jacket, and beside me I have a Black Watch captain's service dress jacket. Can't see below the belt, but he's also wearing a time period kilt. So this represents some of the units who were present at Dieppe. So we're going to get into all of that a little bit later. Obviously, as the museum curator of the RCMI, I'm always keen to connect our material history to the subject matter of events such as these. So as always, we acknowledge the Operation Jubilee's publisher, Penguin Random House, especially for their keen interest in continuing to publish these important volumes of military history. I'd also like to give a special thanks to the Penguin publicity manager, Shauna Cook, for her continued support of these book launches at the RCMI. So in addition to Patrick and myself, we're also going to hear today from the Executive Director of the Juno Beach Center Association, Alex Fitzgerald Black. Alex will speak to the Juno Beach Center's plans to commemorate the Dieppe Raid on the 80th anniversary next year. We thank Alex for joining us today. Of course, our virtual format today has also provided us with the opportunity to more widely reach audiences such as many of you here today from across Canada and the United Kingdom. The RCMI does have a great physical location in downtown Toronto at University and Dundas Avenue, but for those who have been unable to visit in person for our past programming, but have perhaps always wanted to, this is a great format to welcome you in. And again, I say thanks for joining us. We're going to encourage any questions that you may have for Patrick, Alex, or myself. So please submit them via the text in the Q&A box of the webinar, and I'll gather them all at the end of the session. So before I introduce Alex and then Patrick for their parts, I also wanted to say just a few words on our excellent museum, our Second World War collection, and to a few objects related to the Dieppe Raid of 1942. So the RCMI, for those who are both familiar and unfamiliar with us, is an astonishing and hidden gem in downtown Toronto at University and Dundas Avenue. The RCMI has an iconic facade with its stone pillars and two 9-pound War of 1812 cannons right out front. It's a genuine Victorian institution, and it's really a unique academic forum in Canada. The Museum of the RCMI is actually the largest military history museum in Toronto and one of the largest in Canada, with over 12,000 artifacts and archival materials in our collection. The museum has over 6 floors of display space and galleries throughout the Institute. We possess one of the most exceptional and complete collections of firearms, uniforms, and medal sets, I would say, in the world. The RCMI also boasts the largest and most complete collection of Canadian First and Second World War uniforms in Canada. Seen here on the slide, we just have 3 of our World War II artifacts. Far left, we have the boys' anti-tank rifle. It was actually the largest bolt-action rifle of the Second World War II. Quick trivia. In the middle there, we have a Canadian Second World War battle dress jacket, which is named to the 1st Armored Brigade Assault Troop. And at the end there, we have a cap badge of the Canadian Provost Corps. So before I move on to our Dieppe collection, I just wanted to feature our most valuable Second World War object, the VC medal set of Frederick Tilston. So of the only 16 Canadian Victoria Crosses in existence, the RCMI, as a private museum, is very privileged to own one of these iconic and indelible parts of our military history. Tilston, who was a Toronto native and a longtime member of the RCMI, served in the Essex Scottish Regiment in the Second World War, where he won his Victoria Cross on the 1st of March, 1945, near Udem, Germany. So on that date in March, while in charge of C Company, Tilston led his men in the Hochwald Forest across about 500 meters of open ground and through 3 meters of barbed wire and withering enemy fire at the tree line. In the face of this intense German fire, Tilston cleared a German machine gun nest. He consolidated and organized defenses between platoons, and he moved into the open to ferry grenades and ammunition to his men at least 7 times. In the fighting, Tilston was severely wounded in the head, in the hip, and in the legs, but he refused medical attention until he was able to provide the detailed defensive plan to his one remaining officer. The London Gazette wrote on Tilston's actions in 1945, by his calm courage, gallant conduct, and total disregard for his own safety, he fired his men with grim determination, and their firm stand enabled the regiment to accomplish its object. An amazing figure. He lived until 1992, when he bequeathed his Victoria Cross medal set to the RCMI. So we're very happy to have Tilston's set on display here at the museum. So moving on to the theme of our session, the Dieppe Raid of 1942. Obviously, Dieppe is one of Canada's iconic engagements of the Second World War. Dieppe saw nearly 5,000 Canadians land on the beachhead, supported by 1,000 British, 50 Americans, 237 ships of the Royal Navy, and 74 combined squadrons of the Royal Canadian Air Force and the Royal Air Force. The purpose of the raid, which was officially known as Operation Jubilee, was to gather intelligence, destroy German coastal defenses, test the feasibility of a beachhead landing, divert German resources away from the Soviet Union, and to boost Allied morale. So the first of the 3 Dieppe artifacts from our museum collection that I'll feature here today, this is a Canadian map of the Dieppe Raid, which is dated May 1942, so just a few months before the raid itself. So this Canadian map, which is labeled Most Secret, offers us the Allied depiction of the small port town of Dieppe, the surrounding area, and its topographical features as it was in May 1942. The map seen here was provided to senior Canadian officers as a part of the preparation for the Dieppe Raid, which was undertaken exactly 3 months later on August 19th. So here's the map zoomed in. You can kind of see the small town of Dieppe. On the far left there on the coast, you can actually see some of the high walls, which are rather the cliffs, which are represented there. So the map itself is also plotted with all of the known or suspected German defenses, including wires, walls, mines in Dragon's Teeth, which are basically pyramidal fortifications made of reinforced concrete, which are meant to impede tanks and vehicles landing on the beach. It includes fire trenches, machine guns, batteries, anti-aircraft guns, searchlights, and even sound locators. So obviously based on that, it seems pretty comprehensive. But I will say this about this map, and this is what's really important to understanding Dieppe, is that for as much as the map does show us, it's equally important for what it does not show us. So you see, the map you see here was actually compiled almost exclusively from aerial reconnaissance, which woefully failed to faithfully represent the reality of the site's harsh topography and many of the Germans' hidden defenses. Chiefly among these oversights of the map are the imposing 575-foot cliffs which run along the coastline and the beach. Because on the map itself, I mean, you can't really understand sort of the gravity, the sheer size of these cliffs, the imposing physical obstacle that this would have created for the infantry and the armor and moving across the field. You look at this flat map, it really just looks like it could be a low-lying, seawall. The other, of course, physical obstacle, which has been almost overstated in the historiography, but still took out a few of the Churchill tanks as they were lying onto the beach, was many of the big pieces of chert or large stones, which littered the Dieppe beachhead, which obviously famously got caught up in a couple of the tracks of the tanks and nullified more than a couple of them. So the cartographers of this particular map were tasked with creating the picture of Dieppe from an aerial intelligence alone and without the necessary oblique angles of the site. Further, gun placements located within the high cliffs and in the buildings throughout the town were hidden from aerial view and therefore absent from the map itself. So these intelligence failures ultimately resulted in the failure of the raid and its objectives. Of the 4,963 Canadians to land at Dieppe, 3,350 would become casualties, which is a staggering 67%, including 916 Canadians who were killed in action. The nearly 2,000 Canadians who were captured on the 19th of August were then subjected to horrendous treatment, where they were kept malnourished and often shackled and forced into German captivity for the remainder of the war. As I said, this map is ultimately an important piece of Canadian history, and it serves an excellent primary source of understanding the many challenges, both known and unknown, facing the men who planned and participated in the Dieppe Raid of August 1942. So this brings me to our second object of three, and this you see here in the image is a Canadian Volunteer Service Medal with a Dieppe bar. So the Canadian Volunteer Service Medal, which was actually established in the middle of World War II on the 22nd of October 1943, was granted to any person of any rank in the naval, military, or air forces of Canada who voluntarily served on active service and was honorably completed 18 months of total voluntary service from the 3rd of September 1939 to the 1st of March 1947. So obviously this is one of the most common Canadian medals of World War II. I'm sure you've all seen it before. The medal is often adorned with a number of bars on the ribbon itself. Seen on this example from our collection, you have the silver maple leaf bar at the center there, which is often referred to as the overseas bar, which was basically awarded to any individual who had 60 days of service outside of Canada between 1939 and 1947. The more rare and pertinent bar for today's session is the Dieppe bar, which is seen on top of the overseas bar there. So the Dieppe bar was actually not instituted until April in 1994, which is almost 52 years after the raid. And it was awarded specifically to those who participated in the Dieppe Raid of August 19th. The Dieppe bar was made with a unique emblem, as you can see there on the ribbon. It has an anchor, an eagle on very top, and then in the middle it has a Thompson submachine gun, which of course represents all three branches of Canada's armed forces who took part in the raid. And the design itself of the bar was actually created in consultation with the Dieppe veterans and the Prisoners of War associations. So the third and final object that I'll feature in my short talk today is a one-of-a-kind Dieppe prisoner of war flag. So this unique and handmade flag was created and presented by French prisoners of war, and it was given to the officers of the 2nd Canadian Division in September 1944. So in an incredible and sweeping motion of poetic justice, the 2nd Canadian Division, which was the same formation who had been decimated at Dieppe in 1942, had returned to liberate the French town on the 1st of September 1944. The return of the Canadians, of course, was widely celebrated by the French locals. Indeed, C.P. Stacey, who was Canada's official historian of the Second World War, wrote, "The 2nd Divisions reached the town, receiving a delirious welcome from the townspeople." So this flag, which is actually on display at RCMI, you can actually see a photo which I've procured here. This was taken in September 1944 at Dieppe, and more or less right in that week following liberation, this was presented to the Canadians, as an offer of gratitude from the French POWs there. It really is a remarkable piece, and what I'll say about all three of these featured objects, this is sort of my last major point before I pass this off to Alex. So the map, the medal, and the flag will all be loaned to the Juno Beach Center for their 80th anniversary Dieppe exhibition in France, which will be installed most likely in the spring of next year. So this serves as the perfect segue in introducing our next speaker, Alexander Fitzgerald Black. Alex, of course, is the executive director at the Juno Beach Center Association, which is the charity that owns and operates Canada's Second World War Museum on the D-Day landing beaches in Normandy, France. Alex holds a Master of Arts in Military History from the University of New Brunswick and a Master of Arts in Public History from Western University. Alex, I'll pass it over to you for your part.
Thanks very much, Ryan. I'll just make sure I've got everything set up here. And thank you once again for inviting me to give a short chat to the audience. And thank you to Patrick as well for letting me share his stage today. I'm really interested in your book, Mr. Bishop, and I actually have a copy on pre-order, which is, I think it's somewhere probably over the Atlantic at this point. I don't think there's any U-boats slowing it up, though. So just going to talk for about 10 minutes about our exhibits. First thing I want to do is I want to share a very short 2-minute video clip with everybody. Basically a trailer for the exhibit to let you know kind of what's in store. So I'll get that started. Oops. There we go. So I think that gives everybody a good idea of what the exhibit's all about, and I'll just provide you with some details here. So this is a temporary exhibition that will go on for about 2 years at the Juno Beach Center in Normandy. It's going to be there to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the Dieppe Raid. We've partnered with, the RCMI, obviously, but as well, our main partner is the War Heritage Institute of Brussels, Belgium, and they're going to be helping us produce the exhibition and providing us with a number of the artifacts. The dates for the exhibition are approximately, it's probably more like March to December of 2023, March 2022 to December 2023, with a potential extension into 2024 as well. And that'll be presented in our 1,500 square foot temporary exhibition space. I think the video did a good job giving you kind of an overview of the subject matter of the exhibition. It's going to focus primarily on the experiences of Canadian soldiers during the raid, and we're going to use a lot of firsthand accounts to illustrate their experiences and the experiences of other participants. We're also going to heavily feature the press coverage and propaganda from both sides, the Allied side and the German side, that immediately followed the raid. In fact, there's going to be an entire zone or section dedicated to this subject. Secondary areas of focus include, the various purposes behind the raid that Ryan outlined at the beginning, the roles of the Air Force and the Navy, what combined operations was doing and what their purposes and objectives were, and also various factors that compounded the catastrophe, including the planning and the intelligence. We're also going to discuss lesser known aspects of the raid, such as the other nations involved. It was a Canadian force, but it was also supplemented by a great international contribution. We also want to discuss the interactions between French civilians and the raid and the Canadian prisoners of war after the raid. And also we'll have an entire section focused on the Canadians' experiences in captivity. And finally, the exhibition is going to provide visitors with a better sense of how the failures of Dieppe did not necessarily all lead to the successes of D-Day. I know the exhibit is titled From Dieppe to Juno. We're not making the case that, Dieppe, and the sacrifice there automatically allowed the landings at Juno Beach, to succeed and reduce casualties. It's a more complicated story than that, and we're going to discuss that in the exhibit. Artifact procurement. Our museum is a fairly small museum. We don't have, most of our collections are on display. And so when we go to create a temporary exhibition like this on a specific topic, we usually need to get partnerships. And, the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto is going to help us, with those 3 artifacts. Other regimental museums kind of across the country have stepped up to help us out. We're going to have archival footage or video and that sort of thing from sources like the Canadian War Museum, McCord Museum, CBC Radio Canada, that sort of thing. Also, we've managed to reach out to a number of small-time collectors and family members of those who served during the Dieppe Raid, and we've tried to collect some artifacts and some stories from them to share with the exhibit as well. And of course, we have our relationship with the War Heritage Institute in Belgium, and they're going to be helping us secure a number of objects and items. Ryan did an excellent job explaining these 3 exhibits that we're going to have on display. I won't add too much to it other than to say, again, we couldn't do this exhibit without partners like the RCMI. And, I have to say, that flag that was presented by French prisoners of war to the 2nd Canadian Division officers in September 1944. It's going to be so important for telling that story of the return to Dieppe and the relationship between Canadians and Dieppois and the Dieppe citizens. And that CVSM with Dieppe Bar is going to be very important as well. As Ryan alluded to, it didn't actually, the bar itself, the Dieppe Bar didn't exist until the mid-1990s. And, there's reasons for that, and we can discuss them in the exhibit. And that's part of an overall process of how, the Dieppe veterans kind of healed from their trauma and experience, both at Dieppe itself and in the prisoner of war camps later on. And that's going to help us out specifically in Zone 5, which is, entitled Explaining a Failure and a Site of Victory. And one of the sub-themes there is healing, heritage, and memory, and how Canada remembers Dieppe. As many of you will know, the Dieppe Raid is kind of, for many, many years, perhaps until I'd say certainly until maybe the early 2000s, the Dieppe Raid was kind of the number one thing I think Canadians knew about or thought about when it came to Canada's Second World War experience. I think we've moved on from that somewhat with more focus on Juno Beach and some other events. But it's interesting that in a war, that needed to be won in a war, Canada was, played a critical role in winning. We often, for the first 50 or so years after the war, turned to our greatest failure to illustrate that conflict. Very quick note about sustainable design and production. Our museum is attempting to become carbon neutral by 2050, and as part of that effort, we are trying to adopt sustainable development practices wherever we can. So for this particular exhibition, we're going to be reusing the display panels and modules that we used for our previous temporary exhibition, so that we don't have to produce new ones and to save us some costs as well. And of course, allowing us to recycle those to kind of reduce the carbon footprint associated with producing this new exhibition. Just a very quick note about the Juno Beach Center. Just like every other organization, we've been hit by COVID. It's been great to have the support of various, Canadians and, our Canadian government and to some degree the French government. But in order to put on an exhibition like this, it's quite costly. And so we could always use your support. This fall, for Remembrance Day and beyond, we are running the virtual races, the Remembrance Day virtual races. And if you'd like to check those out, we'd really appreciate it. You can register for the race, make a donation as part of your registration, but you can also raise funds for the Juno Beach Center, and there's various prizes and awards that you can win for fundraising. There's various levels that you can get to. If you raise a minimum of $50, you're automatically entered into a good number of draws for prizes. So I encourage you to check that out. If you go to raceroster.com and search Remembrance Day, you'll find our event. And do let us know, if you're running or walking or participating, do let us know who you're doing that for. I'm running for Wing Commander Lloyd Vernon Chadburn, who flew Spitfires during the Dieppe Raid, and he was also at the D-Day landings. He actually died in an air accident in Normandy in 1944. So that's who I'm remembering this fall. You can sign up for our newsletter. Just email us at jvca@junobeach.org, and we'll get you all set up for that. But with that, I'll turn things back over to Ryan, and I'm really excited to hear about Patrick Bishop's new book.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Alex. Obviously, we look forward to our partnership on the upcoming exhibition and for its ultimate unveiling at the center next year. For those who haven't been before, I'll just say from my personal experience, the JPC is an excellent education center and museum, and it's highly recommended to those who are visiting the Normandy landing site. So I'll definitely be visiting next spring, and we're excited to see how the exhibition shapes up. So thanks for that, Alex, and more to come.
Yes, well, thank you. And just to note, the international travel seems to be opening up slowly but surely. The Canadian government just announced that the global COVID travel advisory has generally been dropped, and France is among that list. So, traveling, we haven't had a lot of Canadians the last year and a half, but we really appreciate having some, this summer and in future years as well.
I'll be right next year for welcoming many Canadians back to the center. So once again, thank you. So now we come to the man of the hour. So Patrick Bishop spent 25 years as a foreign correspondent covering conflicts around the world. He's the author of two very acclaimed books about the Royal Air Force during the Second World War, Fighter Boys and Bomber Boys. His other books include Wings, A History of the RAF, and Air Force Blue, which celebrated 100 years of the RAF and was a Sunday Times bestseller. His new book, Operation Jubilee, uses firsthand testimony and recently declassified source material from archives across several countries. Patrick's gripping account brings Operation Jubilee, or the Dieppe Raid, powerfully and vividly to life in an epic demonstration of how ambition, folly, and courage came together in one of the most tragic episodes of the war. Patrick, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Ryan. And thank you, Alex, as well. I'll be visiting the museum as well. I often go to Normandy, and there is a great infrastructure there built up over the years, commemorating the events. I'm also always struck at how enthusiastic the local people are. They're so fantastically grateful for what was done for them, and I think that's something that we should remember and be grateful for in return. Dieppe itself, of course, is the town still bears the scars of the raid. It's the memory of the raid is still very, very present there. And I think that whatever happens, however it's reinterpreted, Dieppe will always go down as one of the great Allied disasters of the war. But I think we ought to put it into some sort of context just to start off with. In the context of the war in general, it's actually quite a small affair. I won't reiterate all the figures that we've just heard about the casualties, but say roughly 3,600 were killed, wounded, or captured. Now, compared with what was going on on the Eastern Front at that time, this barely rated as more than a skirmish. There, the Red Army at this period was suffering an average of 27,256 casualties every single day. But despite the fact that it was a small event in the great picture of the war, it was nonetheless an incredibly powerful one. And I think that's really to do with the tightness, the smallness of the scale. The small canvas conveys the carnage in a way that the vast bloodbaths of the Eastern Front can't. They're just beyond our imagination. We can imagine what happened at Dieppe. I don't think we can imagine what it was like on the Eastern Front at that period. And that's got something to do with the tight focus of it, the way that it took place on a pretty narrow front in the space of a few hours. The first troops went ashore at first light at about just before 5 o'clock in the timings used on the operational orders. And by noon, it was all over. The fleet was sailing for home, and Dieppe, which people remembered as being this rather, pleasant little fishing port come holiday resort, had been transformed in that short time into a scene from hell with tanks stranded on the beach, piles of bodies everywhere, a scene of utter devastation, which is conveyed to us very powerfully by the pictures that remain. Of course, the Germans were very assiduous in recording the disaster, and so we have a wealth of images to show us exactly what it was like. Now, when people hear that you're writing about the Dieppe Raid, the first thing they always, if they can recall it at all, they always ask the simple question: what was it for? What was the point of it? What was it supposed to achieve? And that was exactly the same reaction the British public had when they woke up to hear the news of the raid on August the 20th. But they were kind of quite used to stories about raids, but at this point, a few months before, they just heard about the daring commando raid on Saint-Nazaire on the Atlantic coast, which succeeded in smashing up this gigantic dry dock there, which was the only facility big enough to be able to house the German battleship Tirpitz, the only one remaining in the German Navy, if it actually managed to break out into the Atlantic and needed to put in full repairs, which it undoubtedly would have done. But that's an easy one to explain. That operation has a point, it has purpose, but Dieppe, that's something else. And as we'll see, the organizers of the raid and the propagandists who then had to explain it afterwards really had to scrabble around to find reasons why this thing had been launched in the first place and why the cost in lives had some purpose and some value. But despite these great efforts, even from the moment that the news broke, there were many experts who doubted those explanations and who immediately challenged the validity of an operation like this. One of them was Major General Percy Hobart, He wrote to his friend, the military historian and great military expert of the period, Basil Littlehart. What I don't understand is why Dieppe, he wondered. A raid is either to get information and destroy some worthwhile objective, or it's to train one's own troops. In the latter case, one would not select a strongly selected sector. In the former, what was the objective? Evidently, we did not reach it. It all sounds pretty Passchendaele to me. Interesting that he used that reference to the great Canadian epic of one of the great Canadian epics of the First World War. Now, Percy Hobart was no blimp. He wasn't just sitting airing his ignorant opinions in the safety of a leather armchair in a Pall Mall club. He was a highly talented military engineer. He was an unconventional military thinker. He was a practical man. He trained the what would become the Desert Rats, and he went on to raise a specialized division, that armored division, that would play a major part in the D-Day landings. But Hobart's question or questions had never really properly been answered, despite enormous efforts on the part of historians, and particularly Canadian historians, to find a meaning to the raid. Now, of course, in the search for an answer, there have been some attempts to simplify it to a single cause. I'm thinking, of course, of the approach taken by David O'Keefe, whose thesis is basically that the raid was a gigantic piece of camouflage to disguise the true nature of the operation, which was to seize Enigma material, which was essential at this point if the Allies were going to win the Battle of the Atlantic, which was still far from resolved. Now, I suspect there might be some questions about that later on, so I won't go into why I think that view is a misguided one here and now. Another view, which is more sympathetic to, is that at the bottom it was really down to the ambition of a single man, Lord Mountbatten. That's the view taken by Brian Loring Villa. But in general, I would say my approach is rather broader. It's less dramatic than those two views, but I think it's more plausible. And for me, Dieppe provides in miniature a display of the way that human qualities, failings, human passions that in peacetime are held in check by the constraints of normal life tend to run free in time of war. Those who conceived and managed Jubilee, those who oversaw it, those who led it, were driven by a complicated and sometimes contradictory combination of motives of the sort that only the strange moral ambience of wartime can produce. And I think we've got to be fair to them, and we've got to accept that they were, to a large degree, acting out of noble intent, out of patriotism, out of a sense of duty. But as I was saying, war creates opportunity, and then the normal rules don't apply anymore. So this can mean that war becomes a kind of adventure playground in which ambitious, glory-seeking egotists can run riot. And in this story, the Dieppe story, there is a full quota of people like that. But to start to understand Jubilee, it's necessary to remember where it comes in the timeline in the Allied war. This is absolutely crucial. The first half of 1942 sees a huge sea change on the grand strategic front of the war. America is now in the war, has been since the previous December. Now, the Brits look on this in a slightly ambivalent way. On the one hand, there's enormous relief. They absolutely had to get America in. This had been Churchill's aim ever since war had been declared. But at the same time, it brings a slightly unwelcome new reality to the situation. The British are no longer their own masters. The wishes of the Americans on whom victory obviously ultimately depends, because they're going to be providing the men and the material to win it, and now have to be taken into account. They have to be listened to, and they're almost always going to have to be accommodated. There's another great consideration, which has to be weighed in the balance at all times. On the Eastern Front, the Russians are facing another desperate summer. It's entirely possible, and Stalin said as much on several occasions, that he might decide to cut his losses and do a separate deal with Hitler, thereby leaving much of Europe under Nazi domination, part of the German Empire, the new German Empire. So the pressure for action from Britain's allies was strong, and it was getting stronger. The Soviets, vigorously supported by the Americans, were pressing for an early invasion of Northwest Europe. Churchill and his generals were equally determined to avoid one. They'd already had, by now, many months of bitter failure. They'd had a bellyful of setbacks, and they were determined to forestall a premature operation, which I think they rightly feared was likely to end in yet another disaster. But this disaster would take years to recover from and put off the eventual invasion, perhaps forever. But at the same time, they had to be seen to be doing something. So it was in this atmosphere that the Dieppe Raid was conceived. So you've got to see it, I think, primarily as a political and a propaganda exercise, rather than a serious operation of war. And if you accept that, then Lord Louis Mountbatten was the ideal man to lead it. Personality is a very important story. And you've got some pretty impressive and striking personalities on the dramatis personae. Mountbatten, I like most people, I'm conflicted about Mountbatten. He even to this day, he remains a very enigmatic figure. You can be admiring of him, you can be infuriated by him, almost in the same mental breath. He was himself, it's not surprising, he was a bundle of contradictions. He was vain, he was haughty, but at the same time he had the common touch. He could really relate to those under him, right down to the lowest level. He was also immensely hardworking and very technically accomplished. He had a scientific mind, very important in a highly technical service like the Navy. Yet when it actually came to fighting, he wasn't really much good at it. And if you look at his naval career since the war began, it's littered with disasters, minor catastrophes that would surely have sunk another career if it wasn't, the man in question was not a friend of the Prime Minister and cousin to the King. Churchill overlooked all this. I mean, if Churchill liked you, that was it. You know, you could hardly do any wrong. And so Churchill was prepared to overlook his flaws and rejoiced instead in Mountbatten's optimism, his fighting spirit, showmanship, all qualities that Churchill greatly admired and indeed shared some of them himself. Now, it was this that persuaded Churchill in late 1941 to make Mountbatten chief of the Combined Operations Organization. This was conceived just after Dunkirk, really, to prepare, its long-term ambition was to prepare the way for the great amphibious operation that would one day have to be launched to kick the Germans out of Europe. But in the meantime, its other task was to keep up spirits on the home front with a series of raids, cross-channel raids, amphibious raids into Norway and elsewhere, which would be given the maximum publicity and give the impression that, okay, we are doing something, that things aren't going very well anywhere else, except perhaps in the war in the air by 1942. But we are keeping busy and we are keeping on the front foot. So again, there's a large propaganda element to them. So Mountbatten was very good at propaganda. He's very good at publicizing himself and publicizing activities of those around him. Those around him were very much people in his own mold. adventurous, risk-taking types, many of them pals of his from the upper class social and sporting scene. Mostly, well, perhaps not mostly, but a lot of them chosen for their amiable qualities rather than their competence. Some of them were absolutely useless, particularly the intelligence chief. So inevitably, with an unconventional organization like this, there was a lot of criticism from conventional service types. But they had to admit that the combined operations under Mountbatten actually got off to a pretty good start. I mentioned the Saint-Nazaire raid. That was very good. There'd been a previous raid on the Norwegian islands, which caused spectacular damage, and some Enigma material was also grabbed, which made a huge contribution to fighting the Battle of the Atlantic. But other ones, by this stage, by the kind of time that Dieppe is first decided upon, things are actually going pretty badly. They've had a run of bad luck. Some operations turned out to be damp squibs. There was one called Operation Myrmidon, which was a big raid on Bayonne, down on the French Atlantic coast and towards the south, which was due to go off on the end of April. It started off, but was then aborted because the landing ships couldn't get across the bar at the mouth of the River Adour, which leads up to Bayonne. Various other operations were cancelled by just a general decision that they weren't a particularly good idea. So the whole thing is beginning to look as if it's running out of steam. Now, Mountbatten was desperate to keep this momentum going, keep his name and his organization's name in the headlines. And he also wanted to claim for himself the leading role, preferably, in the invasion of Northwest Europe when it came. So on that subject of Dieppe, you've got to put it in the context of what was being discussed at the time. Lots of raids were under consideration in the spring of 1942. Some of them were absolutely insane sounding. Now, there was one called Imperator, which proposed sending an armored column across the Channel, landing somewhere in the Pas-de-Calais, and then racing to Paris, where an armored column would smash up various military headquarters, turn around, retreat, be picked up and taken home. Mercifully, this never came to pass. It was comprehensively squashed when the fighter command senior officer who was asked for his opinion said, well, if that was happening on this side of the Channel, I'd be delighted, because all you've got to do is shoot up the whatever fuel support vehicles are following the tanks, wait for them to grind to a halt, and then smash them to pieces at your leisure. So this was a pretty balmy idea. And when you look at Dieppe, even though Dieppe might seem pretty far-fetched, it's not as quite as mad as some of the other things that are on the table. Now, the fact that these things were given serious consideration at all, I think, illustrates that imperative for action that I spoke about earlier, even if it was action only for its own sake. And this was pressing down on the British war leadership at this time very heavily. And we have to bear that in mind when we're apportioning blame and trying to get into the mindset of those who directed the operation. Now, once Dieppe had been chosen, the next question was, who's going to carry it out? Who's going to do the job? The task was given to Bernard Montgomery, who was then Commander-in-Chief of Southeastern Command, whose troops were based along the coast, right opposite, on the Channel coast, right opposite Dieppe itself. So they're the obvious choice. He then selected from among the troops at his disposal the Canadian units from 2nd Division to carry out the main attack. Now, there's a lot of controversy, as you will all know, about why the Canadians, Montgomery later denied that he had actually made the choice himself, it had been thrust upon him, he was opposed to it, etc., etc. Anyone who knows Montgomery would know what a slippery customer he is, and this is exactly what you would expect him to say if his name was being attached to something that hadn't turned out to be a success. But why the Canadians? Well, I don't think there's any, I think it was just a matter of convenience. They were relatively well trained. But subsequently, a kind of legend arose that it was Canadian troops themselves who were thirsting for action. They've been kicking their heels in England, this story goes, for 2 years now. And they were desperate to get blooded, I suppose, is the way they would have put it in those days. But I spent a lot of time around soldiers. I've been covering wars since 1982 when I went to the Falklands as a war correspondent. And I can tell you that no soldier, unless they're, apart from a few psychopaths perhaps, yearns to throw themselves into battle, no matter what the circumstances. Yeah, there was a certain amount of impatience among Canadian units, but it was a kind of understandable impatience. They wanted to get on with the war. They wanted to win the war. They wanted to get the war over with and go home, a very reasonable human impulse. What I would say, though, is that there was a certain amount of eagerness on the part of their commanders of the Canadian top brass in Britain, who definitely did lobby for the Canadians to be used. Now, this is an interesting aspect of the story. I think the whole relationship between Canada and Britain, and in the military relationship between military-political relationship between Canada and Britain, you would think that that things might have changed since the First World War. But I found in my researches that the Canadians were still being treated at this point as junior partners by the British generals, and the Canadians themselves were still willing to meekly accept a subordinate role. And this is strange because the two senior Canadian generals overseas, Andy McNaughton and Harry Crerar, had both served on the Western Front with great distinction. Canadian troops had more than proved their worth over and over again, most notably at the great battles of Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele, where they fought superbly but sustained huge losses. And as we mentioned, these bloodbaths were hugely traumatic for Canada. So in the interwar years, Canada underwent the same soul searching that afflicted every country that had been involved in the Great War. For one thing, the Canadians rethought their relationship with the mother country, Britain. And there was a growing resistance to the idea that if Britain became embroiled in another European war, that Canadian boys would meekly troop off again to lay down their lives. But that is exactly what happened. You might have thought after Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele that the Canadians had nothing to prove to the British. But again and again, you see Crerar and McNaughton suffering from a sort of lingering inferiority complex. They're always offering their troops for hopeless ventures. I mean, like in 1940, in late May, early June 1940, where Calais is under siege, McNaughton goes over to Calais. The place is obviously just about to fall to the Germans, and he comes back and says, "Oh no, our lads are ready to go and reinforce the port of Calais," which was a doomed enterprise by even an amateur could see that. So they're always stepping up to the plate and saying, "Yes, we're ready, sir. When do we go?" So when they were offered Dieppe, they accepted it eagerly, even though the Canadians had absolutely no say whatsoever in the initial plan. The subtitle of the book is Dieppe, 1942, The Folly and the Sacrifice. Now, the folly, I think, is evident in two areas. The first, which I've touched upon, is the idea of attacking Dieppe itself, a target that had no strategic importance and was fraught with risks. When you were talking earlier, Ryan, you mentioned the defences and how the aerial photography did not reveal the full extent of the German defences. But I think if you look at that map, that fascinating map from May 1942, it's still bristling with guns. It's clear that even without the knowledge of the guns hidden and the cliff faces, etc., it was a very, very daunting target. And I think subsequently apologists have said, oh, well, if they'd known that there was these extra guns around the place, if there'd been more kind of human intelligence perhaps to pinpoint them, then they wouldn't have gone ahead. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think it was already a very tough nut to crack, even though the intelligence reports say it's a weakly defended target. It wasn't by any stretch of the imagination. So you've got that major blunder to start off with, and it's reinforced by the actual nature of the plan itself. It was a product of many hands, with input coming from Mountbatten's Combined Operations Organisation, the Army's Home Forces Command, the Navy, the Air Force. So as a result, no one actually had ownership of the whole concept, and this meant that no one person was totally invested in its success. Conversely, it also meant that everyone could blame everyone else if things went wrong, which is pretty much what happened. The weaknesses of the plan were clear from the outset. The original idea, which was put forward by the planning team from Mountbatten's planning team, was to put the main effort into two flank attacks either side of the town. Once the defences on either side of the town have been suppressed, and the frontal assault go in. Now, this was actually kind of the conventional thing to do, but under pressure from the army, and it's very unclear still even now how this was actually manifested, the opposite was done. It was this time it was going to be, yes, there were going to be flank attacks, but they would only go in half an hour before the main attack. The main effort would go in on the beaches directly in front of the town, and therefore at the toughest point in the German defences. Now, the risks were well understood, and that's evident in the way that the planning process starts off with a lot of discussion about how are we going to soften up the defences, how are we going to make life a bit easier for the attacking forces. And so the original idea is to have a massive bombardment by air and sea. Now, over a short period of time, these preparations were stripped out of the plan. The Navy was reluctant to risk a heavy warship there. They didn't want a battleship being sunk by the Luftwaffe in the relatively narrow waters there of the Channel. That was a distinct possibility. And the Air Force, having initially said that they would provide a heavy bombing attack, then decided against it for two reasons. One is that they said that it would actually do more harm than good. It would alert the defenders, and it would also clog the town with the debris from the raid, which would make progress into the town, through the town, impossible. These arguments were accepted meekly by the Canadian Divisional Commander, Ham Roberts. It was unlikely that they would have happened anyway, because Arthur Harris, the head of Bomber Command, was very reluctant to divert any of his big four-engine bombers away from what he saw as the main business of the war, which was flattening German cities. So it was that when the troops went ashore, they were supported only by light bombers and fighters and the puny guns of half a dozen destroyers, none of which could make any real impression on the very well-prepared concrete casemates of the gun positions. So the second half of the title of the subtitle is The Sacrifice. And I think that's what happened next can be characterized as a sacrifice to the necessities of the British war as they were perceived at that moment by those directing it. We all know that what happened next. 5 out of the 6 beaches attacked were turned into killing zones. The worst, of course, being Blue Beach, just east of Dieppe, where the men of the Royal Regiment of Canada and the Black Watch stepped out of their landing craft and straight into a blizzard of machine gun fire. I made several trips to Dieppe, of course, during my researches, and I went to Blue Beach several times, and I always found it a very somber and moving experience. I wrote in the book, standing on a summer morning by the sea wall, beneath the gardens that run down to the narrow little beach, it's very easy to summon up the horror of that day. The demonic rip of bullets from the defenders' MG-34 machine guns, pumping out at a rate of 15 rounds a second, the whistle and thud of mortars, and the humped khaki shapes swaying face down in waves clouded in blood. Now, the only real success of the day was a commando raid on the far west of the front at Varangeville, where Lord Lovett's 4 Commando destroyed a heavy gun battery. What was a textbook operation, the only bright point in the day. Elsewhere, it was just failure. It wasn't the Canadians' fault. They were well trained. They were full of heart. They were full of courage. No troops could have done better than the Canadians did that day, but they had no chance of success. They had not been given any chance. It's interesting hearing mention of Juno Beach and the Normandy campaign. Now, 900 men were killed in a few hours. The 900 Canadians were killed in a few hours that morning. Now, compare that with the 5,000 who died in Normandy in 1944, but that was in a campaign that lasted not 8 hours, but 10 weeks. Now, all this sounds devastating, and I think people still kind of, my editor, when he read it, said, sometimes I put my head in my hands and think, how could they have done this? Kind of the people directing the operation, how could they have made this mistake or pressed on when it was clear that this was getting riskier and riskier? But I always try hard in telling stories about the war to put myself in the boots of those who were there at the time and not try and impose hindsight judgments on the participants. There's bound to be mistakes in war. And I think it's facile and it's unjust to treat wartime catastrophes in the same way you would an airliner crash in peacetime. So we have to accept that there were strong political pressures for action for its own sake at this time. And, the losses at Dieppe were fewer, I think, than might have been the case if more madcap schemes like Imperator, the armored dash to Paris had been okayed. So although Montgomery, Crerar, McNaughton, the British Chiefs of Staff, etc., have got to take a share of the responsibility for the catastrophe, I think we can see that there were mitigating circumstances. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case with Mountbatten. We've got to remember that the raid on Dieppe was essentially there were 2 raids on Dieppe. There was the original one, codenamed Rutter, was just on the point of being launched at the beginning of July when it was called off at the very last minute, when the troops were already on the ships that would carry them across the channel because of atrocious bad weather. Now, this was surely the time, people were already having doubts about Dieppe. This was surely the time to bury the project for good. The British had showed willing. It wasn't their fault that they had been thwarted by the weather. This was a good time to get out with good grace. And more importantly, there was now actually something to give the Americans and the Soviets in the offing. There was a huge amphibious landing was in prospect, led by the Americans, which would make a genuine impact on the progress of the war, not just a sideshow, not just a sort of propaganda exercise. And that, of course, was the Anglo-American invasion of North Africa, which would go ahead only a couple of months later, in November. So when Dieppe 1 was cancelled, when Rutter was cancelled, most of those involved breathed a sigh of relief, assumed it was dead and buried, and moved on, but not Mountbatten. It was Mountbatten who insisted that it should still go ahead, even though it seemed highly likely that security had been compromised. It was he who persuaded the Prime Minister and the chiefs that if the Germans did hear about the attack, the proposed attack, they'd assume that the Allies would never be mad enough to assault the same target again. And amazingly, this reverse logic was accepted. Why was Mountbatten so keen to go again? The only answer I can find is that he felt that neither he nor the organisation could withstand the blow to their prestige that would result from another setback. His hopes of heading up the eventual D-Day invasion would be dashed, and so he had to have another success. He had to have another coup in order to keep his star in the ascendant. This, of course, the scale of the disaster, of course, could not be disguised, despite all the efforts of the Allied propagandists to present it as some kind of success. It was obvious to everyone that it had been a terrible failure. So Mountbatten, having gambled on this operation, now finds himself in the crosshairs of history. He was determined to go down as a great man. This was really the main motive driving everything, the engine driving everything that he did. So it's unsurprising that he spent so much time subsequently, so much effort, trying to convince the world that the sacrifice of Dieppe was not in vain. It was he who led the effort to rewrite history, to make out that Operation Jubilee was some kind of scientific military experiment, that it was a rehearsal for D-Day, designed to learn lessons about how to launch a massive amphibious operation. And as such, he would claim it had been triumphantly vindicated. In a speech to Canadian veterans about, I think it was 1972, he pointed out that 12 times as many troops survived the D-Day landings as did so at Dieppe. And this, he claimed, was, quote, directly the result of the lessons learned at Dieppe. Now, many people have accepted this, they've swallowed it, they believed him, and the people who do believe him included many of the survivors. I think that's understandable. If you have been through such a terrible experience as Dieppe, you want it to have some meaning. If you've survived, or if you want to honor the memory of your comrades who didn't, you want to give meaning and purpose to what it was that you did. But sadly, I don't buy the Mountbatten version. I don't believe that Dieppe was a rehearsal for D-Day. For one thing, if that was the case, then the orders would have been structured so the events of the day could be measured and analysed, and mechanisms would be there in place to observe and to evaluate what was going on for study later. There's nothing remotely like that in any of the many pages orders issued to the attackers. Now, it's true that after the disaster, there was a report which produced a section on lessons learned. But if you read them, it seemed to me, I'm not a soldier myself, but I've studied war, as statements of the obvious, and really nothing that could not have emerged from an afternoon in the classroom at Junior Staff College. So Jubilee's a sad story, but even in the depths of the tragedy, I think there are uplifting moments, and the uplifting moments all come from the conduct of those who had the doomed duty of putting the plan into action. Reading the after-action reports, one is humbled by the number of stories of incredible heroism, dedication, but above all, humanity, the way that the soldiers looked after each other. The memory of Captain John Foote, VC, of course, stands out among a myriad of other extraordinary tales of selflessness. So in conclusion, I'd just say that Dieppe, disaster though it was, underlines the fascinating paradox of war that underpins our great interest in the subject. War is terrible. It's mostly an abyss, sorrow and waste. But out of the darkness, again and again, you glimpse the light of human greatness. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Patrick, for that great speech. I was happy, as I'm sure our audience was, to have the British perspective on Dieppe. As Alex was noting earlier, we get almost bombarded in the Canadian curriculum on Dieppe as it relates to Canada, the Canadian experience. So it's great to have an international perspective at the time. So thank you for that. Now we're just going to take a few questions now. Before we do, I'm just going to give everyone in our audience, if you need to take off, just a quick update on one of our upcoming events. I'll say that the marquee event of our RCMI museum will be upcoming on Saturday, November 6th. This will be our Military History Symposium. We have a great lineup of historians led by Dr. Tim Cook of the War Museum. So be sure to register. It's a free event. It's all virtual, online at rcmi.org under event registration. So thank you for that. So let's move on to our question and answer period. Once again, to our audience, if you'd like to submit your questions into the Q&A box below, that would be your chance to do it now. So I'll start us off with the first question. This comes from Commander Fraser McKee, longtime RCMI member. We'll start with Patrick, but Alex, you're welcome to weigh in on it as well. So Fraser asks, at the local division level, should not the G1 intelligence, Colonel Churchman, not have done a better job of anticipating German fire from the known cliffs above the main beach? The Church were truly an unknown and experienced obstacle, but not the defensive.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true. What struck me was the absence of human intelligence in the picture. So it's all done from aerial photography. There was actually a French underground team who visited Dieppe in March and made a systematic study of the town's defences. Unfortunately, through a chapter of accidents, this report never made it back to London. I'm not sure it would have made a huge amount of difference. It had, because both the army level and the COHQ level, they seem to put pretty low kind of value on what most lay people would think would be a primary source of intelligence, i.e., eyewitness reports on the ground. There was no attempt to put an agent in of their own across the channel. There was no attempt to land a kind of little commando unit to check out the beach. So the composition of the beach was a massive hole in the intelligence picture. Now, when they did some kind of half-hearted research on how tanks would behave on shingle, as they called it, but where they actually carried out the experiments was on Dorset beaches, where the conditions are nothing like they are. Dieppe, they'd be much closer to the Dieppe conditions if they'd done the experiment on beaches around Dover, but that didn't occur to them. So there's a lot of kind of a kind of slapdash approach which had fatal consequences.
Yeah, if I can add a couple things, I think the issue with the Dieppe Raid plan is that there's too many interlocking pieces that if one thing fails, the rest of the plan just simply unravels. And what I think Churchill Man and the other, planners were relying upon was firstly, those landings on the flanks at Puy and at Pourville. And the idea was those cliffs would be in Canadian hands before the main, landings on the main beach happened. So it wouldn't be, nearly the obstacle. They also relied on, rather than air firepower or, hard air power, they were relying on the smoke screens that the Navy and the Air Force would generate. But of course, there's, a smoke screen is, tentative at best. You've got to continuously lay it. You're at the will of the winds. The other thing, of course, being, at least on the flanks, they were hoping to get the advantage of darkness. And unfortunately with Puy, there were various delays that meant they did not land in the darkness. They landed after dawn. And so there were just too many things that could fall apart. And when one thing fell apart, necessarily something else did. And then the whole plan just unraveled on them. So I think they were thinking about those things, but they just didn't put in enough supports to make sure that the plan could work in the case of, a small failure.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, but also the timings were highly unrealistic. So the idea that you could actually get off the beach, get up onto the eastern headland, the western headland in half an hour is insane. As someone said, Dennis Whitaker is a very, interestingly, very critical of the plan, etc., but he completely contradicts my view. He says there were great lessons learned at Dieppe and lists and enumerates them at some length. But he said, you were giving to a company a job that would take a battalion to do in the time that you were supposed to do it in. So yeah, I mean, it's just ridiculously unrealistic time from start to finish.
Great, thanks guys for weighing in on that. Our next question is from Bob Kennedy. Bob, also an RCMI member and the editor of the Fife and Drum Journal. He asks, this is brief, but a good one. Did Dieppe serve its ultimate purpose by failing? Patrick, I'll let you speak to this.
Well, I can see what you're getting at there, and that would presuppose that lessons that were not obvious were learned as a result of those sacrifices. I don't have to believe that. I think that, as I said, I think most of the approaches that were later attributed to Dieppe were things that would have occurred to anyone, any intelligent soldier laying his plan just by study and by previous experience. You didn't need, I think Max Hastings summed it up actually by saying in his review of the book a couple of weeks ago, it was afterwards claimed that Dieppe taught important lessons for D-Day. This is true only if it is indispensable to stage a fiasco ahead of a proper operation of war. I think that's basically it. I mean, there were one or two things that did come out of Dieppe, like the use of inshore heavy fire support, rocket ships, etc. But I don't think anything more than that really can be. You can draw a line between the disaster of Dieppe and the success of D-Day.
I think Robert's also kind of clarified his question a bit. He was talking more specifically as well about the delay of the second front. And we recently were just talking about Dennis Whitaker. And of course, that's, one of his major points is that, he kind of, his conclusions are quite weird, but one of them is that essentially, Churchill and Mountbatten, they all pulled off a huge coup by making this happen because it avoided a second front in 1942 that would have failed and been even more of a disaster. I don't really think there's enough contemporary evidence to make that case. I do think, to Mr. Bishop, to what you were saying about, lessons learned, I absolutely agree with you. I think one of the things I would add to that is sometimes in order to learn lessons perhaps properly, there needs to be a heavy blood price that's paid for everybody to sit up and pay attention. But I generally agree with you that, these lessons would have been and were learned, and other lessons were learned in the course of various operations in the Mediterranean and elsewhere throughout the war between August 42 and June 44.
Right. Excellent on that. Well, I have a question to sort of ask Patrick and Alex, of course, weigh in as well as a discussion. Is there any way that Dieppe could have been a success, or was it doomed to fail from the start? For instance, had the Allies, committed and been able to achieve aerial superiority, was there a pathway to victory, or was this no matter what they were going to fail?
Do you want to go first, Alex?
I mean, on that specific point of air superiority, I haven't read your book, so I don't know your conclusions on it, Mr. Bishop, but I think the Allies were able to obtain a good measure of air superiority, not air dominance over Dieppe, but I would say they had a good measure of air superiority during the raid. Now, it cost them fairly dearly in terms of aircraft. So I don't know. I just can't see, people have often said, oh, well, if they had the heavy bomber support, for instance, would that have helped things? Well, the problem with the bombers, of course, is one, it can kind of tell people you're coming if you have to do it in advance. But secondly, the targets for those bombers are basically the town. Like that's what Bomber Command can hit. And if you smoke the town, you've just created a huge tank obstacle for yourself. And you already have to deal with the tank obstacles to get into the town. So I'm not quite sure that any measure of air support or air superiority could have made a significant difference to turn this thing from a failure into a success.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I mean, at that point, Bomber Command is incapable of hitting anything smaller than a town. So, yeah, it'd be completely indiscriminate bombing. There's a human element to it. You'd also be killing large numbers of Dieppe. The town was still quite heavily populated. I think there was still at least a third, maybe a half of the population still there. So that was something that Churchill was very, very sensitive about. And it would have contributed very little. I think perhaps a naval bombardment would have been more accurate, but how much more accurate? I don't think it would have tipped the balance. No. So I think it was unwinnable. I don't think it was ever going to succeed.
Fair enough. So it was doomed to fail is your conclusion.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's in a different space-time continuum where like everything goes right and, they land under the, in darkness and all of the objectives are taken. Yeah, but that doesn't leave any room for any mistakes or any, the meeting in with the German convoy that was running down into Dieppe itself. You can't have things like that happen and you can't control things like that. So I just don't think it's reasonable to expect that this plan could have resulted in a success.
Mm-hmm. So we have a comment, I think, / question from another attendee. I think what they're trying to get at is whether the Allies felt pressured to do something in 1942 to appease Stalin and the Americans, just to see some sort of action. What do you think of this, as opposed to pushing the raid further down the line to 1943? Do you think 1942 with the timing was best given all the circumstances, or was it necessary?
Yeah, well, I think that's what I was saying earlier on. Was it necessary? I think things were changing quite fast, even though that pressure was definitely there. If they had been a bit more resolute, as I say, Torch was on the horizon. North Africa was about to be invaded by an Anglo-American force, but that was a real operation for. That was something that really did force the Germans to take up and sit up and take notice. But you've got to remember, though, that many things are happening in parallel. So I don't think Dieppe probably crossed Churchill's mind more than a couple of times that summer. And it was like, oh, yes, Dieppe. Oh, yeah, carry on. I don't think he pondered it very carefully. If he had done, he might well have decided not to approve it. Whether he actually did, how much approval he gave to it is, of course, a controversial question, one that Brian Villa is devoted a whole book to. I suspect that he never really gave it very serious consideration, and it fell into that category of, well, if it comes off, great. If it doesn't, well, it's not the end of the world.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that Operation Torch, which went in November of 42, that was kind of the thing as well that Churchill offered to Stalin. And I believe they decided about torch in kind of July 1942. And so I think some of the pressure was off by the time, not for Rudder necessarily, but by the time the actual Jubilee raid went in, a lot of that pressure was gone. And it was, I think it was more of a Mountbatten and the Canadians kind of getting together and saying, we want this to go ahead. And they were the ones pushing it at that point more than anything.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I think that that's why, you know, if there is finger pointing to be done, then it's pointing in the direction of Mountbatten, because as we agree, the pressure is coming off, because they can now turn to Stalin and say, look, this, I know you wanted to be in Europe, but this is the next best thing. It's in North Africa. It will actually force the Germans to make strategic shifts. For one thing, they invade France. You know, they, up until that point, there was an occupied and an unoccupied zone. So they have to extend themselves into what was the unoccupied zone. So yeah, it does have strategic consequences in a way that Dieppe was never going to.
Okay, I think we have time just for two more questions. This first one comes from Anthony Hopkins. I don't think it's the actor, but same name. Anthony asks, apparently flank attacks were considered early in the operation. Why were they abandoned?
Do you want to do that one, Alex?
Sure. I think part of the reason they were abandoned was similar to what Patrick was talking about in terms of, and I think it's Imperator, or the raid on Paris, essentially, is this idea that, are we going to be able to do this all in, 12 hours or what have you, to attack on the flanks, to actually assault a port, a fortified area, and then withdraw from the main beaches. And I think they kind of determined, midway through the planning, that that was not reasonable. And they also, there was river obstacles. The one big thing they wanted to, use was the Churchill tanks. And there were some river obstacles between the selected beaches and the town of Dieppe that they were not, if there's a bridge destroyed or whatever, you're in trouble trying to get there. So those are some of the reasons I think they discounted the early flank attack plan.
Right, fairly answered. So let's go with this final question. I think it's a fitting final question. This one comes from Cam Ross, whose father was actually a company commander in the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders during the Dieppe Raid. So yeah, great to have a son of a Dieppe veteran. His question is, I'll have both of you guys weigh in on it. It's directed to Patrick. I'll have you go first. Patrick, you spoke about the reasons for the raid. Could you speak a bit more to how the Dieppe Raid accelerated the transition from British command of Canadian formations to Canadian command? Could this have been a pre-raid desire or a post-raid out?
Well, I don't feel very qualified to talk about this, actually, having not studied the period immediately afterwards. But I think my instinct would be that surely there must have been political pressure thereafter for Canadians to be in at the birth of an operation and to have some voice in how the plan was developed, how the troops were going to be used. In terms of the actual relationship between the British and the Canadian commanders, it didn't seem to me to change very much. I mean, there's still a lot of condescension coming from Montgomery towards Carrera in particular. So I don't think that it had a profound, as far as I can see, it didn't have a profound effect on the British mindset, or the mindset of British top brass towards their Canadian cousins. Over to you, Alex.
I guess one of the things I always like, I think it's important to point out, is that I completely agree with what you just said, Patrick. The Canadian generals, mainly Crerar and McNaughton, were very keen on this operation. And yes, there's the issue of, the Canadians came in kind of midway through and most of the initial planning was already done. So there is that issue. But generally speaking, I think it doesn't quite change the relationship, as you've said. The one thing where things do change, and in particular, this shows its face in 1944, is when, and this is again the Montgomery-Crerar relationship, Crerar misses a meeting. They're getting in early September 1944, they're planning Operation Market Garden. And Crerar misses a planning meeting for Market Garden to go to Dieppe to be there for the ceremonies that 2nd Division is going through with the French civilians. And Montgomery actually threatens to fire Crerar and say, you disobeyed an order, you didn't come to this meeting. And Crerar said, well, sir, I had 800 reasons to be at that meeting. And so you do see, Crerar understands that he's working within the larger British Commonwealth to win this war, but there are going to be times at which the Canadian interest must go first. He is a national commander, just as in the tradition of the First World War with General Currie. And he will take exception to those slights, and he will do the right thing by Canada, if you will. And he did in 1944. And that's actually kind of one of the little tidbits of the story that we're going to be telling at our exhibit next year.
Yeah. That's a fascinating story. That really is, does say it all, as that way. Yeah. Great.
Excellent. Well, great insight there. I think we'll end our Q&A session at this time. Just to conclude, the book is Operation Jubilee, Dieppe 1942, The Folly and the Sacrifice. It's available now through Penguin and Random House Canada, wherever books are sold, online through Chapters and through Amazon. So thank you, gentlemen, Patrick, Alex, for joining us. We look forward to the exhibition next spring. For those who can make it to France, I'm sure it's going to be an epic occasion. We look forward to including some of our astonishing museum collection as a part of the exhibition next year. And we look forward to future collaborations and events. Once again, we'll be hosting our museum symposium on Saturday, November 6th. If you'd like to register for free through rcmi.org. Thank you again for attending, for all of those who are online now. This session will actually be posted to our RCMI Toronto YouTube channel within the coming week. So there will be a wider audience who will be able to partake, and I'm sure it'll be appreciated by our wide membership across Canada. So once again, thank you to our panelists, and we'll sign off here.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Cheers, gentlemen. Thank you.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.